Hey everybody, welcome to Q&A video number 66. Make sure to keep asking questions, doesn't matter about me about anything. Just know I do not respond to review requests or Let's Play requests in these videos, but I will respond to those in the comments. Once again, a review request is something along the lines of, hey, would you tell us about your thoughts on insert game here? So don't ask me that sort of thing. That is a review request. It is not going to get answered in a Q&A. Now, if you have a question about a specific feature of a game or something surrounding it in the news, then feel free to ask that, but otherwise, don't ask me about what I think about insert game here. The gameplay in the background is of the original Heroes of Might and Magic because it ties into the third question here, which I get an awful lot, so I'll answer it yet again, even though I've answered it before. But before we get there, let's go ahead and start with a question from Tiger King. What do you think of World War I and its criminal underrepresentation in games? Well, as you said, it's criminally underrepresented in video games, and that's partly because when you think about World War I, you don't think about much other than trench warfare. And it's kinda hard to make a game about something like that, but there were other things in World War I. It was actually a pretty big time for change. I mean, it was the first large-scale war we saw using things like machine guns, airplanes, tanks, so there's a lot more to it than simply hunkering down in a trench and waiting for things to happen. And there were a lot of different things going on during the war. It wasn't just the Western Front in France and Germany, so they have a lot of stuff to draw from. It's just that they never decide to do it because, again, the common perception of World War I is trench warfare. And of course, people have that misconception that it would be pretty boring. Although, with World War I, it's more of a question of how do you actually convey the attitude that World War I brought. I mean, think about World War II. In video games, it's mostly been a very cinematic thing where you have games like Medal of Honor just parroting that ridiculous cinematic notion you get from a lot of war films and doing the spectacle over substance thing. And that's because you can get away with doing that because in World War II there was a clearly defined bad guy. You had the Nazis, and everybody knows that the Nazis were horrible, so it's pretty easy to justify wholesale slaughter in those particular video games. But when you get to World War I, everything is really murky. The soldiers were basically fighting and dying to preserve imperial values that were on the way out anyway, so they were effectively fighting and dying over absolutely nothing. How do you capture that feeling in a video game without it coming across as incredibly contrived? I mean, you can make World War I multiplayer games and they'll work out just fine because then you don't need to worry too much about actually creating a tone, but in single player, well, that'd be a lot harder. So I'm curious to see if anybody ever will pick up World War I as a setting for their video game, and if they do manage to pull it off, it would be pretty awesome. Because I feel like World War I is actually becoming kind of forgotten, and that's not a good thing. Next question is from Zozo Gogo. What is the worst scam game you've ever seen, as in a money sink like EVE Online and Age of Empires Online? Well, probably any number of mobile games that I see all the time that are like, hey, you want to progress further in the game? Why don't you buy these gems or these weird in-game currency things with real money? And hell, that mentality spills over into a lot of free-to-play games on PC, where you go into them and they basically make it a massive pain in the ass to do anything without actually buying premium currency or whatever. Basically, the idea with those is, hey, you can either grind for about 30 hours to get this one thing, or you can just pay us $5 and you can have it right now. Again, I can't stand that, and it drives me crazy, and there's too many games to list for what is the worst one I've seen. Particularly when you consider that those particular games fall under my homie don't play dat principle. So I tend to avoid them like the plague, and for good reason, because they're basically scams. I really don't get that particular type of free-to-play mentality. Anyway, moving on to the third question and the one where Heroes of Might and Magic comes in. This is from Lewis H. What is your opinion on emulation, and when, if ever, do you think it's okay to emulate a game? I could not tell you the number of times people ask me about emulation, to which I feel like I should just point to every single DOS game video I've ever done because they all use DOSBox, which is a DOS emulator. The footage you're seeing right now of Heroes of Might and Magic 1, that's a DOS game. You can't run that in modern Windows, you have to run it through DOSBox, and that's exactly what I do. It's perfectly fine. But of course, that's not what you really are asking when you're asking me what I think about emulation. You're asking me what I think about piracy, because that's what this is really all about. Emulation itself is perfectly fine as long as you have the system in question, and if you have to pull a BIOS file from that system, you pull the BIOS file yourself. I've got no problems with it. But that's not really the major problem. Where the major problem lies is ROMs. You see, ROMs are how you actually play the vast majority of these games, because you can't just take a cartridge for, say, an Atari 2600 and plug it directly into your computer. That would be great, don't get me wrong, but it's not the case. So what ends up happening is people need to make ROM files of those particular cartridges. It's basically like an ISO file if you're more familiar with that particular terminology. It's the entire contents of that particular cartridge or disc or whatever it may well be, packed into a single file that can then be loaded by your emulator. And as long as you make that ROM yourself and have absolutely no intention to distribute it and use it only for your own personal purposes, it's perfectly fine. Here's the problem with that. The vast majority of people don't have the technical knowledge or the actual hardware necessary to be able to do something like that, and so they just go on the internet and download a ROM file from wherever they can find it, and that is a commission of software piracy, which, if you've been living under a rock for a while, is a violation of copyright law and thus is rather illegal. Now, of course, I am of the opinion that copyright law needs some pretty drastic reform, but until then I generally tend to avoid emulation unless it's something that doesn't require a ROM file, like, say, DOSBox, for example, because in that case I can just stick my floppy disk in the floppy drive or stick my CD in the disk tray or whatever, and then it will just load up that on Windows, and I can't use it on Windows, but then I can just boot up DOSBox and run it through that just fine. But unfortunately, something like that doesn't work with, say, my GameCube, where I actually tried to run Dolphin, and I tried to use just the GameCube discs in the tray, but Windows wouldn't even read them as discs at all, so that's pretty problematic. So there you go. If you ask me what I think about emulation, I'm just going to redirect you to this. And as far as more recent developments go, I think it's actually kind of amusing that some developers and publishers have actually moved toward emulation. For example, if you get Mortal Kombat Trilogy on Steam, it's actually basically running an emulator wrapped in Unreal Engine 3, which is a really weird way of doing it, but it's still an emulator. The Sega Genesis collection on Steam is all emulation. The Neo Geo games that the Humble Bundle sells are all emulation. It's just kind of interesting to see certain companies starting to pick up on emulation as a good way of actually selling some of their old products. And it actually helps us out in the long run, because then we can get fully legal copies of old games that haven't been available for sometimes over a decade or more. So that's pretty cool. And I certainly hope that more developers and publishers pick up on the fact that their old games are actually wanted and that people will actually still buy them if they release them in a convenient package. Because let's face it, no matter how crappy some of those old games are, they don't deserve to just be completely forgotten and left in the past and not able to be played by modern players. Anyway, moving on to a question from the Gaming Patriot. What's your opinion on the deep web, and do you ever plan to browse it? I don't care about it at all. I imagine you were probably expecting a more detailed answer, but that's seriously it. I really do not give a single solitary crap about the deep web or the dark web for that matter, so sorry, I guess? Anyway, let's close out this Q&A with a question from Radical Edward. What are your opinions on censorship? I absolutely despise it in every single form, no matter what form it takes. Which is probably going to sound kind of ironic, because sometimes in my videos I bleep out the cussing. It may not seem that way, but I actually do that for comedic effect, because let's face it, a censor beep is actually kind of amusing when you really think about it. And particularly if I'm not really cussing very much in a video, I mean, I might say damn or ass or hell or something like that, because they're very, very mild curse words and it's really hard for me not to say them actually. But more often than not, I don't cuss in my videos, so when I do manage to let out one and it's just out of nowhere, sometimes it's actually very amusing to me just to beep it out because it's such a rare occurrence. But there's a difference between beeping out words because it's funny to do so and beeping out words because you're offended by them. In the former's case, you have the option to use it, but you don't have to, and if you do use it, it's because you thought it would work well with timing. In the latter's case, you are preventing people from seeing the content because you find it objectionable. At that point, you are basically pushing your own beliefs on everyone else, which is why it bothers me so much. Americans in particular have a really nasty problem with this because in the US, it's basically socially acceptable to be offended by just about anything and everything that comes in your path. I mean, to give you a prime example that makes literally no sense whatsoever, a lot of Americans get completely bothered by mothers breastfeeding. Because clearly using breasts for their intended biological purpose is somehow morally wrong? I'm just completely baffled by that. But that's the kind of censorship that bothers the hell out of me, when you're restricting things that are completely unreasonable to restrict simply because you personally find them objectionable. That's just not fair to anybody. And when it becomes an institution, it's even worse. For example, the Index in Germany. If you're not familiar with that, they have a list of things that are considered harmful to the youth, and thus they are effectively banned in the country. Now, of course, a lot of the stuff on that list is stuff that promotes Nazism, and obviously you can understand where they would be rather leery of something like that, but to outright ban it because it's considered harmful is just ridiculously overstepping what is really up to individual choice, and that's just not really acceptable. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I generally consider most people to be somewhat rational at the very least, and when they see something that is blatantly promoting Nazism, they're going to be like, no, I'm not going to go for that. Or if it's something like Mein Kampf, they're only going to read it for purely historical interests. Although that mentality is definitely being shaken up quite a bit now that Donald Trump is doing so well in his race to become the presidential nominee. But I digress. The point is that I view censorship as an absolutely horrible thing that should be completely abolished. Because as long as whatever it is doesn't break any laws and doesn't actually harm anyone, then why should you really be so bothered by it that you want to actually have it banned? That's incredibly selfish. And that was Q&A 66. Make sure to keep asking questions. I can't do these Q&As unless I get good questions to actually put in them. So I will do the next Q&A whenever I get enough questions to do so. And I'll catch you guys in later videos.